All right. So one of the things we discussed is using some of the money we're making off Patreon to start writing a role playing game, and that's a very broad, like, where do you start? Like, what what's you have to have a seed of an idea. So we figured we would start with kind of picking a genre and kind of building it out from there. And we thought we would get some fan interaction on this as well. And we've kind of picked out roughly 10 types of games, genres of games that we might be interested in doing. And we're going to put them together in a list and let the fans kind of rank them from 1 to 10. And we'll see what people think we should, what people are interested in, right? I
Be
started.
warned, this is not a democracy. This is much like the Brexit referendum. This is a non-binding vote.
Yeah. It's more so there are a couple things on this list that Mike and I think are interesting. And if the overwhelming response from people is that sucks, well, we're not going to do that. Like, we'll take some kind of guidance and feedback, but at the end of the day, it is our decision. This is a benevolent dictatorship. But the idea is that we're going to produce something at the end of this. It would be nice to be kind of aware if there was a market for it. So,
That would be nice.
if people are like, we're not interested in the Bear Swarm superhero game, okay, good to know.
Right.
No matter how excited we are, maybe that's not what our opening volley is.
We'll do it later.
Yeah. Man, listen, on a long enough timeline, Mike and I write a superhero game.
Probably.
So, again, 10 genres. We'll kind of talk about today. We'll kind of go over them, some of the ideas for what we could do with it, why we're kind of interested or excited, like what about it kind of speaks to us. And then in the episode and in the show notes, look for a link to a ranking system. It's a system that votes either or, so it goes through all 10. It's like, would you rather have a this or a this? And then you kind of vote it until you get a ordered list of the 10 things. And then you'll take that and you'll send it off to us, and it'll be great. It'll be good. It'll be super. You'll love it.
Maybe. Yeah, you might love it.
And then we'll compile. Like, I'll compile all that data together, and we'll go. What are people interested in? What are we most interested? Like, Mike and I have already ranked these, so we know what we're most interested in. But the top 5 are easily stuff that we'd be interested in, and then the rest of them are like, that could be really cool. We could do something neat with it. I started with like a list of like 200 literary genres and just kind of narrowed it down to like things that I thought were specific enough to be evocative and things that Mike and I were both kind of in agreement we would be interested in working in. While I would love to write a Western, Mike is not interested in Westerns. So
Yeah.
why?
Besides, you already wrote a Western.
Didn't write a Western. Have I wrote a
Yeah,
Western?
you kind of did write a Western.
I don't remember writing a Western.
You're one that's about country Western music and
Oh, I never.
American myth and all that
Yeah, I
stuff.
never published that though.
I didn't say you published one. I said you wrote a Western.
And it's less of a Western. It's a country music game.
Listen, I'm not interested in splitting fucking hairs with you over, with you having the express purpose of getting Western back on the list. It's not gonna happen.
No, it's
I'm
fine.
not interested in writing a Western.
So, real quick, gonna do a high level overview of the 10 genres that we've narrowed this down to, and then we'll kind of go into each one and talk about what about that appeals to us, right?
Sure.
So, in no particular order, we have prehistoric fantasy, military, dark fantasy, sword and planet, mythopia, superhero, spy, occult, criminal, and family saga. All seem pretty cool, right? I'd play a game about any of those things.
Yeah, I probably have played a game about a great deal of them.
So let's start by talking about one that is a little more unique, I think, something that I haven't seen a lot of, and that's prehistoric fantasy.
Yeah, I find it an intriguing concept because just about every other flavor of fantasy off the top of my head I can name something that's done it, right? Like the fantasy set in like a Roman Empire era or an ancient Greece or medieval is obviously everywhere, Victorian, um age of exploration, modern day, like everything. But when I saw that I was like, that's interesting. How would a prehistoric fantasy, like how would that feel different from other fantasy genres that are much more explored, and what sort of new ideas would you kind of play with under those circumstances?
So I think one of the things that I kind of want to wrap my head around first is what exactly is prehistoric, right? So like uh, literally, it's before history, and I'm going to assume we mean more written history than like verbal history, right?
Right,
Because like if it's before history, before like human existence, I'm not interested in making a game about dinosaurs.
right.
Uh,
And on that same kind of idea, like I'm not necessarily interested in writing a game about like the uh the caveman trope, right?
yeah,
Like the grunting dude in a loincloth with a club going out and beating saber-toothed lions over the head. No, I'm interested in like the rise of like in the transition from like hunter gatherer to agricultural era when
yeah,
civilizations is just starting to be a thing. Like that sounds like it could be really interesting.
yeah. I so that's kind of where I went with it, with kind of like the Indus River Valley and the early Mesopotamia, like even like ancient Egypt, maybe. Because like Egypt has a super long history, or anything kind of in the Fertile Crescent, right? That we kind of see early human civilization, and that's kind of what where I'd want to go with it, like a fantasy world where like the height of technology is still like, I mean, levers and pulleys, right?
Yeah,
Like still pretty rudimentary. Like one of the things that I think is very impressive about early man is that we were capable of building like monolithic structures with very little like modern industrial technology. And I was listening to a podcast that was talking about like the building of the pyramids, and like the pyramids took decades to build, and they would only work on them during certain months of the year when they like the weather was right. And it's that playing a fantasy game with that kind of time scale where it's like, yeah, you your character could live and die while these giant like monuments are being constructed, I think is really
yeah,
fascinating, you know.
yeah. And a little bit on the fantasy side of that, because like a prehistory game is different than a prehistoric fantasy game. I think that not I think I know that in the majority of fantasy games, magic is a thing that comes from the past. And typically what makes like what you're exploring when you go into a dungeon or whatever are these ruins of past civilizations and stuff like that. I think that part of what's interesting in the idea of a prehistoric fantasy is when you don't have who came before you as the standard trope for the Age of Wonder. Like, what does it look like when you're living in that Age of Wonder,
Yeah.
as opposed to looking back on it? When there is no Age of Wonder that came before you, like it's a fantasy game. So like, who's the first dude that came up with magic? Right? Like inventing magic would be an important thing in this game as opposed to uncovering lost knowledge. It's all new.
Yeah.
Everything has to be new as opposed to like ancient and old and found again,
Well, it's
which I think is a really interesting approach to that, to the a lot of the traditional fantasy elements.
yeah, I think it's really interesting. Like, it's not about like rediscovering lost text. It's about writing that text for the first time.
Right.
It's, your question, like, who's the first guy to cast a spell? It's him. He's
Right. Yeah,
he's
that's what I
over
mean.
there. Like, there's this revolution going on in this world that is magic.
Yeah.
It's mysterious because it's unknown, not because it's ancient and lost.
Yeah. The first guy that forged a sword out of iron rather than copper.
Yeah.
And then he went and talked to the first wizard in the world and put fire in that sword. And that's how you have a flaming sword made of iron. And that's fucking crazy.
Yeah.
And that dude's a king now. The guy that has that sword. Because
Yeah.
he has a magic sword and there's like 6.
Yeah.
Because magic's new.
It accomplishes something that I'm not a big fan of fantasy, and part of it is because of the proliferation of magic. I really don't like, in D&D, by a certain level, everybody has a magic +1 sword. Like, I like magic to be super rare, super, like, I like it to be dangerous. I like it to be ritualized. I like it to be, like, not reliable, even. And I think if we did, like, a prehistoric fantasy, it's magic becomes about experimentation. It's about, like,
Yeah.
I have this new power source. What can I do with it? And then things like magical objects and artifacts, like, there are, less than a few dozen scattered across the empire. Like, and every single one of them is, like, named and owned by somebody powerful and important. Like, it's, do you have,
Right.
like, that guy has the magic sword. He is a warlord king because that sword is unbreakable,
Right.
And I also like it because it prevents it from being, like, commonplace. Like, right, the guy with the magic sword also has a huge target on his back because not everybody in his army has a magic sword.
Right. That you have a magic sword doesn't necessarily mean that you can take out 100 dudes who come for you.
Yeah, but
You might be able to. Who knows?
it does mean that if you know how to use that sword, you're gonna fuck somebody up with it.
Right. I think it opens up a lot of interesting ways to portray and not just from a storytelling perspective, but even from a design perspective. Because if you're writing a game that is about the discovery of these things, then you don't. Maybe you do, but you probably don't want it to be the same in every game, right? So you almost need an engine to create magic that would give you different kinds of magic.
Yeah.
So every time you run a campaign, the magic's a little bit different, right? Like, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
I think that a lot could be done there.
I think there's a lot that we could explore with that. But I feel like we've talked about it quite a bit, and we have 9 other things to discuss.
Right.
So one thing that, like, quick disclaimer, just because we talk about something a lot doesn't necessarily mean we are more or less passionate about it. We have a lot to say about prehistoric fantasy because both of us kind of hit it tonight and went, oh, wait, hey,
Yeah.
it's fresh.
Yeah. I think probably we'll talk more about things that struck us as underexplored as opposed to more interesting.
Yeah. So next up, let's discuss doing a military game. I know you're a big fan of military action.
I am. You and I have talked before about military games. Particularly, there was one idea that we were banding about for a bit about an asynchronous military like espionage game. And I mean, I'm a big fan of Tom Clancy stuff, particularly like Without Remorse and Rainbow Six. I'm big fans of. Um,
I think real quick, when we start talking about military, we should set the scope properly because I am not interested in making a game about infantrymen.
right.
I'm interested in like special ops
Right.
or even like generals, commanders, leaders. Like I think it'd be really interesting to do a role playing game where it's a military themed game, but you're not necessarily even on the battlefield. You're commanding troops.
Yeah.
You're controlling a battle.
Hmm. Yeah, like maybe, and maybe even the military game is not an action game in any capacity, right? Like maybe it's more akin to like you're all in the situation room. So like you're the fucking army guy, you're the navy guy, you're the air force guy, you're the White House guy. Here's the problem. Fucking deal with it. And none of us are going to fire a shot in this military campaign.
Yeah,
Uh,
and your character sheet has things like like I have like these 4 battalions I can deploy. I have
yeah,
these reconnaissance units. They can go do this. Like everybody has access to different ways to get information or intel or
yeah,
resolve certain like you know uh, it can also start to get more like military political where it's like,
hmm,
all right, I know we have this big problem that we're all trying to deal with right now. I have this unit that's in enemy territory. If you can send in somebody to pull those guys out, I can go do that.
yeah.
Like, you know,
Or maybe even like instead of being all from one nation, like maybe you're all UN.
yeah,
Like you're yeah, like or like NATO or whatever. Like you're part of some international council that's dealing with stuff. So you're like, somebody's got to deal with the fucking the Somali pirates. They need fucking dealing with. Uh, fucking Russia's invading Ukraine again. We got terrorists attacking. We've got chatter about a terrorist attack in London that's looming, and we've got Mexican cartels. We have 4 issues that need dealing with.
yeah. And there could be interesting things like there's terrorists in London, but the German military ambassador is like, I mean, I'd help you out, but moving troops into Britain right now, it's not gonna.
That's big time against the international law. That is what we call in the international circles an invasion. Despite the fact that you want me to do it, I literally can't. So I can't send my 3rd Infantry Regiment. I can spare a Spec Ops team though,
But
if
if
that'll get the job done. But you got to keep that shit quiet.
and it could be really fun, like a few games later, be like, so remember when you sent that Spec Ops team in?
Yeah,
I have footage of that, and I
yeah,
really need you to go do this for me now.
yeah.
And like
That sounds really interesting. Like that could be a lot of fun.
with our love for politics, like not like boring, mundane
Right.
politics, but like politicking, I guess. Uh, Plus that high tension of a military situation, I think that could be grounds for really fun stories to tell.
Yeah. I question whether that would be better served as a board game style game as opposed to an RPG, but I think that it bears discussion, right? Like I think that you could go either way. I'm not sure which one suits it better.
I mean, there's no reason we can't design a board game
That's true.
uh, like anything you and I design is going to be role play. And
Yes.
I think us working on a role play style board game could be a lot of fun too.
Sure.
Next up on our list that we're going to discuss is Dark Fantasy. Fun fact, one of the early games that I ran for Mike was a Dark Fantasy game. It was Midnight, which
Mhm.
is the Lord of the Rings if Sauron won.
Yeah.
Evil's taken over.
If Aragorn put on the ring and stabbed Frodo in the face, and yeah, basically if Sauron corrupted everyone and just took over the world.
So my point is, Mike and I have a history of dark fantasy, like going back into dark fantasy. and I think we're both into a very particular style of dark fantasy, which isn't like oppressive and brooding, and you're not like I'm not particularly interested in the dark fantasy where you are the darkness, but I really love dark fantasy when you are that last glimmer of hope. You're the last
Yeah.
little light left in the darkness.
Hmm.
When you're against literally the whole world is evil and against you, and you are the last remnant of good and hope and purity in the world.
Rage against the dying of the light.
Yeah. So I think if we do a dark fantasy game, we're definitely leaning into that trope, right?
We would do heroic dark fantasy, not grim and smothering dark fantasy.
Yeah. It's something. So I was working on a superhero game that I really wanted to be like this, like this. I wanted the world to be very gritty Frank Miller world, but your characters were very like almost Jack Kirby heroic, like good guys. And I really like that juxtaposition of like your characters are capital G good people, and
Hmm.
everything else around you is everything dark and gritty that you've kind of come to expect from the genre, and you're the outlier in it. You know, it's you're not just another detective that's gotten thrown off the force and has a drinking habit, and you know, you're gonna go,
All Star Superman bumps into Rorschach.
yeah. So that's what I'd like to do with the dark fantasy as well, where it's like, no, like your characters are the last heroes in the world. And what does it mean to be the last hero? Like
Hmm.
you all know that you can't risk making any sort of concessions to evil because you're all there is, you know?
Right.
And I really like that.
You can't give an inch to evil when you only have 1 inch left, right? Like, there's no concession to make because that's it. Evil has everything else.
And I think it's really interesting exploring characters through that lens. Like when you're putting them into morally ambiguous but dark questions, and it's like you you have no choice but to do the right thing. You know, pretty soon it could very easily start to look totalitarian, like no compromise, right? You can't
Right.
compromise with evil, but everything's evil.
Right.
So how do you balance that? Like,
When the world is evil, do you consider Superman a mass murderer? Because he can't let evil go because it's evil.
so dark fantasy.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Sword and Planet. And when Mike was reading through the list, he's like, "What is Sword and Planet?" And my big touchstone for it is something that Mike doesn't have a touchstone for, which is the John Carter series, the Chronicles of Barsoom. Edgar Rice Burroughs. It's a Civil War soldier is transported to Mars and swashbuckling occurs. So Sword and Planet is a derivative of Sword and Sorcery, which is like very Conan the Barbarian, right? But combined with like science fiction, Flash Gordon, Star Wars kind of elements. So it's, you know, it's about swords and planets.
While I don't think it's accurate, at least, I think that a easy way to think about it would be take Warhammer 40K and strip out all the nihilistic, grim, dark bullshit, but keep like the idea of like Star Knights, like in the Space Marines, right? Like these guys that have like power armor and chain swords and machine guns and go planet to planet, having adventures and fighting evil and oh shit, like literally like a Space Marine versus a demon is a thing.
Yeah.
And the Space Marine will fight him with his giant power axe.
I think one of the things that I think would be fun to explore with something like this is taking like all the fantasy tropes and turning them into science fiction tropes. So like having demons, right? But demons are just an alien race that happen to align with the human characterization of what a demon is. So it's yeah, there's a planet of demons over there. They're aliens. They have a civilization and a culture. They just happen to be red and horned and winged. I don't know how much room there is to like, because eventually, like you hit like space elves, right?
Right.
And that's less interesting. But
Right.
I think one of the things with Sword and Planet, like so, for me, a big distinction between science fiction and fantasy is that element of magic, of the fantasy tropes. And I definitely wouldn't want that in a Sword and Planet game. I wouldn't want there to be like spellcasters like out there. But I like the idea of, and I worked a little bit of this into a sci-fi game that I wrote where like, so guns are super dangerous in space, right? Like if you shoot a handgun in the International Space Station, you can take out the International Space Station.
Right.
So if you take that and follow that through into the future, well, knife fighting becomes more appropriate for being in space. Like, so using swords and weapons like that instead of firearms, I think it starts to make sense if you can explain it in that way. And I'm always interested in exploring a science fiction game that isn't laser guns and spaceships.
Yeah.
So
imagine Captain Picard with a rapier,
yeah,
kind of a deal.
yeah,
Like there's not necessarily magic, but there's definitely weird shit out there that you don't quite understand.
yeah. There's Alien,
Right.
but there's not.
And some of those aliens are gods.
Yeah.
Like Q's a thing. He can do whatever he wants.
Next on our list to discuss is Mythopia, which was a new term.
It's another term that Mike didn't know.
It was a term that I didn't know until I stumbled across it, and it's essentially the literature of creating mythology, of either reinventing, like reinterpreting, or like creating on your own mythology. So, like a good example of it is recently Neil Gaiman went through and wrote the like stories from the Norse pantheon, like just kind of retold in a more modern tone, and that is a work of mythopia. That's him taking the stories that he knows and putting them through his lens and reinterpreting them.
So sort of an American Gods or a Scion sort of feel.
Yeah. And so there's a few different lenses we could take for this. Like we could do like existing mythological frameworks in either a modern time or like a science fiction future time or whatever. Like what does it look like if we take a cyberpunk world and inject the Greek gods? Like technology has run rampant. The high end are essentially Zeus and Hera and Poseidon. Like Poseidon is an executive of a company that literally controls the oceans of the world at this point, right? But it's all filtered through this cyberpunk framework. And I think stuff like that could be really interesting. I also think it'd be really interesting to make a game about creating myths, where you kind of build the framework for how to tell mythological stories, and your characters become, like, you play stories of Zeus and of Hercules and...
Yeah, you play the character who will become Hercules.
Yeah. A game about myth building.
Yeah. Sounds cool to me.
Do you have any other thoughts on that?
No. I mean, sounds neat. I think that one's definitely one that has a lot of wiggle room in terms of how you could define it.
Yeah. I think the important thing is we're going to be making a game that is larger than life, that is about building mythology. That mythology
Right.
either existing or new, features prominently in the narrative of the game. So, not a huge leap to talk about this next one, which is a superhero game.
I think we need to heavily explain our interest in this and what the genre means.
So, here, like, I'm not confident that we would be able to do a better superhero game than our favorite superhero games.
Right.
That makes me a little hesitant.
Yes.
Marvel Heroic, Smallville. What's the new one that you got that you were really enjoying?
I really like Spectaculars.
Spectaculars. The Sentinels of the Multiverse role playing game. Like these are all the style of superhero games that Mike and I really enjoy. So it's going to be difficult for us to kind of break out of that.
Yeah, I think we would be excited to try, but not at all certain whether we would succeed in making something that is significantly different, is different enough from those to justify its creation.
Now, what I think we could really knock out of the park and do, I think you and I could be good at, which is why I think it's worth exploring this, is I think you and I could build a really interesting superhero world for our game to take place in. Similar to how Greater Than Games built out the Sentinels multiverse, I think we could build out our own comic book universe that would have some really interesting ideas in it.
Yeah.
And I'd be really interested in, like, maybe even focusing more on a game that is a little more setting heavy and a little more rules light. Just because I think exploring that kind of that is where we could have a voice.
Right. That's definitely true.
And then if we just pair that with a few mechanics that we really like, that we think really reinforce that, but kind of focusing more on building out like our trinity of superheroes for like the version of Justice League, or like, you know, even taking things that we've already established in other games. Like we have Mike created a version of Suicide Squad called Resolution 7 in one of our games, and building out that concept and that, like, figuring out how that fits into the universe, I think could really bring, we could bring something to the table with that.
Yeah. I'm extremely confident in our ability to setting, build, and story tell in any of these. But I think that you're right, in a superhero game, I think we would have to focus a lot more on it and be comfortable with that's where we're making our mark, as opposed to on the game design side.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of really good superhero games out there.
And that's the thing. Like, even the superhero games that we really like, there are so many other superhero games. Like, Mutants and Mastermind isn't our kind of game, but that doesn't mean it's a bad game. And for somebody, that is the best superhero game.
Yeah. People love Champions.
Like, I'm a lot more willing to tackle the process of creating a fresh mechanical idea for a prehistoric fantasy or a Sword and Planet game, because the world isn't already inundated with games of those genres. Whereas superhero, it's going to be really hard to mechanically stand out from the pack.
Yeah.
But our setting, that's where we could get them.
It's true. We would make a hot ass superhero setting.
That'll be the quote on the back of the book. This is a hot ass.
Yeah.
And what we mean is it literally takes place in a desert. And it
and no one wears pants.
Yeah, the primary mechanic measures ass sweat. It's a hot ass.
Listen, we said we weren't sure about the mechanic side of it, so
initiative is whoever had swamp ass last.
Yep.
All right. Next up, let's talk about making a spy game. Mike, am I just saying the sweetest words in the English language to you?
I mean, I think my utter disdain and lack of caring for spy stories is very well documented. I couldn't be less interested in anything espionage based or about spies or the Cold War, mixed loyalties, conflicting loyalties, not knowing who to trust. These are all things in stories that just don't interest me in the least. So I'm not really even sure why it's on the list.
I think it's
I really like
because
spy stuff.
I think it's because we did a spy setting on Bear Swarm of Old.
Did we?
Yeah.
Really? I don't remember that at all.
The Strawman Chronicles, I think, is what we called it.
Legit, I was being sarcastic. Like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, like there were a few episodes of Bear Swarm where we built out a setting of like
Hmm.
the post Cold War gone hot, maybe what the world would look like and who the superpowers would
That
be.
that sounds a little familiar. But yeah, I don't remember that at all.
We could easily just
Um,
pick up where we left off by reviewing those old
sure,
episodes.
it's true. We could do that. I like legitimately. I don't fucking remember it at all, so it'd be new to me. Um, but yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I'm a really big fan of Tom Clancy stuff, military espionage. Uh, you know, not knowing who to trust. And it's almost like those are really easy ways to tell stories of any type. And a spy story, what I think is strong about a spy story is that it fits into just about any other genre. So you want to do military espionage? Okay. You want to do fantasy espionage? Okay. You want to do cyberpunk espionage? Okay. Like it all works and it all relies on the same base principle. And that principle is just that humans naturally don't trust each other. And that's the like every bit of drama, and this is almost certainly hyperbole, but every bit of drama ever written is based on that simple principle that humans don't trust each other, or they do trust each other until they shouldn't, or
Yeah.
they don't trust each other and then they should, right? Like human trust is where all drama comes from. And any spy or espionage story is just built around that thing that everyone can understand of not knowing quite who to believe in. I think that's what makes them so strong.
And I think we also have a legitimate good leg up because one of the best mechanics for a spy game is Outer Wilderness of Mirrors. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
The trust die mechanic is so strong. Like my problem with Wilderness of Mirrors is it doesn't do more with that mechanic. It's just kind of there it is. And we happen to know the guy who wrote that mechanic, and I'm pretty sure we could be like, hey,
I've talked to him once or twice.
we're gonna take that and build on it.
Yeah.
And I think if we kind of focus the game around, it's a spy game in as much as it's focused on espionage and intrigue, but it's really a game about who can you trust and how far can you go with that trust.
Yeah.
Next up, let's talk about an occult game. Mike, you love the occult, right? You're
I,
part of a cult.
I'm part of a cult. Am I?
Just roll with it. Come on, improv, man.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
totally. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the Circle of the Crescent Moon. I've been very vocal about my involvement for years, and about the coming of the Lunar King. I think everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about. And for my fellow brothers and sisters, may his pale light shine upon your face. Um, this was one that when we were talking about it, I was a bit surprised in the interest that I had, but I think the we've talked about this before, but I think it was like in that long ass period when we weren't doing the show. One of the organically created fictional kind of universes that I've found the most interest in the past like probably like 15 or 20 years is the SCP Foundation. Um, and contrary to like dark fantasy, I really like where and when we were talking about dark fantasy earlier, we were talking about doing like the glimmer of hope in the world that's been swallowed. So like you would be like the last rays of heroism. What I really like about stuff like, and if you're not familiar with SCP Foundation, it's kind of like an extra dimensional. It's really hard to describe. Just go read some SCP stuff, and you'll get it pretty quickly. But it's basically built around a secret division, bureau, corporation. You're not really sure what. That's all about containing supernatural, extra dimensional stuff and making sure that the world doesn't know it exists because some of them gain power. The more people that know that they exist, then they destroy the world, maybe. But what I like about it is the idea that existence is fragile and you need to protect it. Like, it's dark, but it's a little bit, it's almost like the reverse of the dark fantasy where like the whole world is against you, and it's more like evil is in this fucking box, and no matter what, I cannot let this box open because the world depends on it. I think that that's really interesting, and exploring just like the different sort of weirdness out there, I think could be really fun.
One of the things that I thought of when I was thinking of Occult was something else I know that you are also a fan of, and that's True Detective.
Yeah.
And if we could figure out how to kind of capture a game where there is occult overtones throughout, but nothing is ever really substantiated. There's never like a monster right there, like proving this thing, but there's all this belief and people, and like cults are real and cultists are real, but uh, you know, in season one of the
Is it all bullshit?
yeah, in season one of the True Detective, is the Yellow King real? Is it extra dimensional? Is it just a guy?
That's fucking crazy.
Yeah, like, and I think doing a game that kind of threads that needle a little bit of you're out there, you're investigating weird stuff that's all plausible, but is all ritualized and focused around this implausible thing. I think it'd be a ton of fun.
Yeah.
It might be
And True Detective could easily be Act 1 of an SCP story,
yeah.
right? Like, oh, I see some weird stuff, and then like after the credits roll, that's when the SCP guy walks up and is like, "Hello there.
And I think
I'm going to need you to never talk about this ever again."
I think it'd be really fun if we could do something similar to how Dogs in the Vineyard did their kind of like, are the dogs just normal human people, or are they literally the empowered by God?
Right.
And kind of having that sliding scale within the game of like, is the occult real or not? Let's answer that question
Right.
before we sit down and play. And this game will support both kind of styles of play. And the game is all about investigating and digging into the weirdness of humanity.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, like it almost doesn't matter whether the occult is real, right? Like cultists that stab you, you're just as dead.
Yeah, like people believe there's a monster inside of this box that if got out would destroy the world.
Right.
Does it really
That's real.
Does it really matter at the end of the day whether there is a monster inside that box or not? Because you can't let that box get open.
Right.
As soon as
And
as
yeah,
you
but what I
confirm
think
one
is-
way or another.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is like, okay, like you spent the entire game being told that this box, if ever open, will destroy the world. And at the end of the game, you decide that your character doesn't believe that. Do you open the box? What if you're wrong?
Yeah. Cuz that's the thing, like the world ends, which means the game ends, which means we're done here.
And if you're smart, as soon as perhaps even a heartbeat before the character answers that question, you go, game over. We stop playing. The game is done. And then they go, well, what happens? You go, game's over.
Just
Did you open the box? And they take that breath to answer, and you go, game over.
because there's only two answers. Either you open the box and the monster was real and the world's destroyed, or you open the box and the monster's not real and your entire life has been meaningless.
Right.
Either way, the
And
game's
not
over.
yeah, the game's over in either way. And I think that not knowing the definitive answer to that question, like it's like the end of fucking Inception,
Yeah.
right? Like the answer to the question doesn't matter to the sense to the rest of the story. And that the question goes unanswered. Potential like I'm not saying that is how the game would be built, but like if I was telling the story, like that's how I would run a campaign.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and
There's this box. If it ever opens, the world ends.
and
You have been entrusted with it.
we would want to put elements of that, if not that exact thing, but that attitude into the game.
Right.
Right. The answer to is there a monster sleeping in the ocean is not definitive proof by the end of this campaign.
Right.
The game is about the belief that some people have that that is real, and you're being tasked with ensuring nobody ever finds out.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing there is at the end of the game, like from a player's perspective, the question of what does your character believe,
Yeah.
and never ever gaining definitive proof one way or the other if you're right.
I think that'd be fun.
I think that's the kind of horror that I actually like of not knowing, never being sure.
Yeah. And really, out of our list, this is kind of as close as we get to horror.
Yeah.
You know, dark fantasy probably has some horror elements in it, but it's more monster than scary, right?
Yeah.
So occult. All right, two more to go. Next up, let's talk about making a game about criminals. So it could either be a game where you play criminals, or a game where you are against criminals. Say you are law enforcement.
Yeah. It is a game about crime. And I think that to a certain extent, this has some tonal overlap with a military game, in that, or the kind of military game that we were discussing, in that it's unlikely to be an action game, and it's more likely to be a talking game. It's almost like you and I like talking,
Yeah.
and politicking and cutting deals, and uh, not quite knowing who to trust.
Well, we like our
Who's telling the
action
truth.
to be quick and brutal and efficient and done, and with hit locations.
It's true. I don't know what it is about hit locations that you and I both fucking love, but goddamn, I love me some hit locations. Anyway, I think perhaps why this stuck out so much in my mind was, as I mentioned earlier, I had just watched a fucking Scorsese movie, which is all about like the mafia and Jimmy Hoffa and the Cold. Like, it's not about the Cold War; it's about the mafia during the Cold War and Cuba and the Kennedys and all that stuff. But I think that it's really interesting, especially if you approach it from a mafia standpoint, of the idea of recruiting, building your family, building your gang, your team, your your whatever, the people that surround you, and learning to trust them when getting burned by it, or burning them when the heat comes around the corner, right? You got to be able to walk away. Um, I think that there's definitely something there. We could just make Heat the RPG. You know, do that.
I mean, not particularly. I don't want. It's a high bar.
But the idea of like building up your team, and trusting some of them with some information and others with other pieces of information, and or even like being a detective that's running a sting operation on the local organized crime family and trying to figure out who's where and who's at the top and who answers to who and who's involved in what. I think that there's no shortage of very fertile ground in a game that is about crime, particularly organized crime.
Yeah.
But it could easily start as street level crime and then escalate, right? Like as you quote unquote level up. You're just a dude mugs people, and then someone takes notice of you, or you're just a beat cop, and then you make a good caller, and then captain notices you and you get promoted. It's whatever, working your way up those respective chains to
So
control more of or influence more of the crime that's happening.
one of my ideas for a criminal game that I think would be a lot of fun, it would kind of be an interesting take on it, is to have players playing both sides of the equation. So have everybody, like, the idea, like, doing some things that I'm actually not a fan of, but I think in a certain way I could make myself a fan of. So not necessarily having it be level based, but having a level, like a progression base for the game. So everybody kind of starts as, you know, fresh cadets out of the police academy, or entry level, like low street level criminals, and then telling the story of these people building their career and their way up together. That, you know, you're the guy that I busted slinging dope on the street corner my first week on the job, and now look at where we're at. Like, I'm the police commissioner, you're the head of the family.
Right.
You
I
know,
run the entire east side, and you're the captain of the precinct.
and then the relationships between those people and that kind of story, and then the question of, like, what does it take to get somebody on the other side? Like, does the player who is the dirty cop versus the player who's not the dirty cop, versus the player who is a loyal criminal versus the player who is ratting out everybody to the cop,
Right.
that interplay, I
Does
think.
does the dirty cop, when push comes to shove, does the dirty cop side with the criminals or with the police? When he's the only one in the room with a gun,
Yeah.
who does he shoot? If he has to shoot someone,
Or, I mean, saying, like, take any combination of that. Like, you have the good
right?
cop with the dirty cop and a criminal, and the dirty cop's
Yeah.
pressuring the good cop to look the other way. Do you turn on your brother?
Yeah.
And I think there could be a lot of, like, so I'm not a fan of, like, kind of locked progression games, and I'm not a big fan of PvP, but I think both of them together in this this light, I could have a lot of fun making a game like that,
Yeah.
where it's about building your character up in contention with the other players who are building their characters up at the same time.
Yeah.
And then the big catch to it is, like, there's no mechanical way to kill another player, right? Because I can't just have you, good cop, shoot my criminal in the face for a session and be like, oh, yeah. So you have to have some kind of guardrails on there to ensure that it's a game about these people growing into power together and what that dynamic relationship looks like.
Right.
Anything else to say about crime?
I think the reasons why it could be interesting are very clear.
All right. Last thing we're going to talk about, and then we'll do some shout outs and get out of here, is Family Saga. Now, there's a few different ways to take this, because it is kind of a broad kind of set of words. My first gut reaction to this is something that I know you're also a fan of, is a game that is multilineal. So it's, you go into it and you are telling the saga of a family. So everybody plays members of that family across multiple generations. So it's, you play your great grandfather all the way up to
Right.
who you are today.
You play 4 to 5 generations of the same family.
Yeah. And it's
building up that family's legacy over time.
Yeah. And I don't have a ton to say about it, because I think that's the game. Like, that's the center, like, pillar that you can just hang the whole game around. It's, all right, like, session 1, let's talk about our family and figure out who our family is and what our family looks like. and what our ambitions are, and where do you know, like, where do we
Yeah.
come from, where are we going, and that could be anything. And you know, depending on how we want to do this, it could be across a lot of different genres, a lot of different settings.
Yeah. One of the things that we were talking about before we went on is like we just talked about crime. So you could do a family saga crime game where, you know, one person's the mafia, one person has a long, you know, heritage of being in the police. You know, dad was a cop, granddad was a cop, great granddad was a cop. Um, and every generation, like asking the question of, do you follow in your father's footsteps? And if not, you know, what do you do? And how does when dad was a cop, granddad was a cop, great granddad was a cop, how does dad feel when you go to mafia?
Yeah. And
Or you know, military or anything? Like I think that that one really fits well with just about any other genre that we've talked about, because very similarly to some of the others, I think that the idea of a family lineage is something that's pretty easy to understand. It's universal to a certain extent. Of everyone understands why you would want to do this, or can put themselves in that position, at least enough to play a game.
so a couple things that I really like about it is that it removes the assumption that most role playing games of, like, where your family's not super important. Where in D&D it's easier if you're just an orphan,
Yeah.
and it makes your family literally everything. Like, that's the crux of the game, is who your family is and what they're about and what those relationships are. And yeah, like, from like a criminal game into a fantasy game, like, you know, if your family is the founders of an empire, like, first session it's all right, I'm going to unite these tribes. Second generation, all right, we have to keep these tribes together. Third generation, okay, there's other tribes that we need to start integrating. Fourth generation, you and your siblings fighting over, like, how do you keep everything united? Does everything fall apart like the Mongol Empire into all these like subkhanates? You know, that story of a family empire, right, is pretty easy to understand and visualize and kind of interpret.
When the succession war inevitably comes,
Yeah. And
who who comes out on top?
And I think the big thing when we talk about a family saga game that we're talking about that is different than any other genre we've talked about is that multi-generational approach to it. It's You're going to go into this game with the assumption that your character will have a child who will have a child who will have a child, and so
Right.
on. And it's not something you see a lot in role-playing games, which is also one of the reasons, similar to prehistoric fantasy, you don't see a lot of it. That'd be cool. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, if we take those two things we don't see a lot and do a prehistoric family saga,
Could be wild.
could be amazing.
Could be amazing.
With crime and the occult.
Get some military in there. Some Sword and Planet. Fuck it. Let's get a spaceship in there.
Let's just cram all 10 into one
Yeah.
and call it GURPS.
A family saga, occult, crime, spy, myth, superhero game set in space that's a dark fantasy that's about the army set in prehistory. I've read that fanfic.